If you were to look at the state of Israel on a map today, you would see a sliver of land barely the size of New Jersey, situated at the eastern edge of the Mediterranean Sea. Despite its diminutive size, comprising just over 8,500 square miles, this nation possesses a level of geopolitical influence, military capability, and economic innovation that rivals countries more than 10 times its size. It is a global leader in technology and science, known colloquially as the startup nation, and maintains one of the most powerful military forces in the Middle East. However, beneath the skyscrapers of Tel Aviv and the modern highways that crisscross the Negev desert lies a land that has been fought over, conquered, and resettled more times than perhaps any other place on earth. For thousands of years, this narrow strip of territory has served as the crossroads of empires, the cradle of religions, and the ancestral homeland of a people who have maintained a continuous connection to it for millennia. But how did this tiny, arid strip of land survive centuries of conquest and exile to become the modern, powerful state we know today? This is the history of Israel. The story of the land begins long before the modern state, or even the ancient kingdoms, ever existed. Geologically, the region forms a natural land bridge connecting the continents of Africa, Asia, and Europe. This unique geography meant that from the very dawn of human history, the territory was destined to be a highway for migrating peoples, marching armies, and traveling merchants. By around 3000 BC, the area was inhabited by a Semitic-speaking people known as the Canaanites. They established the earliest city-states in the region, building fortifications around settlements to protect their valuable water sources in the arid landscape. For centuries, these Canaanite city-states operated under the shadow of the great empires of the time, most notably the Egyptians. By 1500 BC, the land had effectively become a vassal state of the Egyptian New Kingdom, which exerted its control from the Sahara all the way to the borders of modern Turkey. However, the geopolitics of the ancient world were volatile, and by the 12th century BC, the region experienced a cataclysmic shift known as the Bronze Age collapse. Great empires that had stood for centuries began to wither and crumble, leaving a power vacuum in their wake. It was during this era of upheaval that a new group began to emerge in the hill country of the central Levant. These were the Israelites. Initially a loose confederation of tribes living in the highlands, they began to coalesce into a distinct entity, separated from their neighbors by their unique religious devotion to a single god. According to tradition, and supported by the archaeological record, these tribes gradually consolidated their power. By the year 1000 BC, they had captured the Jebusite city of Jerusalem and established it as the capital of a united kingdom of Israel under the leadership of King David. David's reign marked the transition from a tribal society into a regional power. He succeeded in unifying the 12 tribes of Israel and securing the borders against the neighboring Philistines. But it was his son and successor, King Solomon, who would elevate the kingdom to its peak of ancient splendor. Under Solomon's rule, the kingdom grew in wealth and prestige, engaging in trade that reached far beyond its borders. His most crowning achievement was the construction of the first temple in Jerusalem. This grand edifice cemented the city's status not just as a political capital, but as the spiritual epicenter of the Jewish faith and culture. Following Solomon's death around 930 BC, the unity of the kingdom proved fragile. Deep-seated tribal tensions over taxation and labor boiled over. A civil schism split the nation in two. The 10 northern tribes broke away to form the Kingdom of Israel, keeping the name but establishing their capital in Samaria. The southern tribes remained loyal to the house of David, forming the Kingdom of Judah with its capital still in Jerusalem. For the next 2 centuries, these sister kingdoms existed side by side, sometimes allies, often rivals. They were prosperous at times, yet vulnerable to the colossal empires rising in the east. The first blow fell on the northern kingdom of Israel. In the 8th century BC, the Neo-Assyrian Empire, a brutal and highly militarized superpower, swept across the region. In 722 BC, the Assyrians conquered the northern kingdom, destroyed its capital, and deported its population to the far reaches of their empire, giving rise to the legend of the 10 lost tribes. The southern kingdom of Judah was left alone. Although it survived the Assyrian onslaught, it remained a small vassal caught between the warring superpowers of Egypt and Mesopotamia. By the late 7th century BC, the balance of power shifted as the Assyrians were defeated by the rising Neo-Babylonian Empire. King Nebuchadnezzar II sought to expand his territorial holdings and secure the trade routes of the Levant. He besieged Jerusalem in 597 BC, installed a puppet king, and deported the elite of society. But the people of Judah remained defiant. Just over a decade later, in 587 BC, a rebellion broke out against Babylonian rule. Nebuchadnezzar's response was swift and unforgiving. He marched his armies back to Judah and laid siege to Jerusalem once more. This time there would be no mercy. The Babylonians breached the walls and razed the city to the ground. Most devastatingly, they destroyed Solomon's temple, the very heart of the nation's spiritual life. The surviving population was rounded up and expelled from their land, marched hundreds of miles eastward to live as exiles on the plains of Babylonia. For many ancient peoples, such a defeat would have marked the end of their history. Their cities destroyed, their gods defeated, and their people scattered. They would usually assimilate and vanish. But the people of Judah, now coming to be known as the Jews, were different. In the rivers of Babylon, they sat and wept, yet they did not forget. They preserved their laws, their history, and their faith, waiting for the day they could return to their homeland. It seemed like the end of the kingdom of Israel, but in reality, the story was only just beginning. The Babylonian captivity, which had sought to erase Jewish identity, ultimately had the opposite effect. Instead of assimilating into the melting pot of Mesopotamia, the exiles strengthened their resolve and codified their traditions, dreaming of a return to Zion. Their salvation came from an unlikely source in the east. In 539 BC, the Babylonian Empire was conquered by the Achaemenid Empire under King Cyrus the Great. Unlike the brutal conquerors who came before him, Cyrus adopted a policy of tolerance and benevolence toward his subject peoples. He issued a decree allowing the exiled Jews to return to Jerusalem and rebuild their city and their holy temple. Beginning in the late 6th century BC, waves of exiles began the arduous journey back to the Judean highlands. Although they were now back in their ancestral homeland, they did not possess political independence and remained a province within the vast Persian Empire. Nevertheless, they succeeded in reconstructing the temple, ushering in the Second Temple period, which would define Jewish life for the next half-millennium. For 2 centuries, Judea remained a relatively quiet backwater of the Persian Empire. But in 332 BC, the geopolitical landscape was shattered by the arrival of the young Macedonian king Alexander the Great. He swept through the region, defeating the Persians and bringing the land of Israel under the cultural influence of Hellenism. Although Alexander's reign was short-lived, he died in 323 BC. His conquest permanently integrated the region into the Greek world. After his death, his vast empire was carved up among his generals, and Judea became a frontier zone contested between the Ptolemaic dynasty in Egypt and the Seleucid dynasty in Syria. After a century of warfare, the territory passed firmly into the hands of the Seleucids in 198 BC. At first, the Seleucids respected local customs, but over time a cultural rift began to widen. Many Jews, particularly the urban elite in Jerusalem, embraced Greek culture, adopting its language, dress, and customs. However, this shift provoked deep resentment among traditionalists in the countryside who viewed this assimilation as a betrayal of their covenant with God. Tensions reached a breaking point in the 160s BC under the rule of the Seleucid king Antiochus IV. He launched a campaign of persecution, outlawing Jewish religious practices and desecrating the temple in Jerusalem by dedicating it to the Greek god Zeus. This sacrilege sparked an armed rebellion led by a priestly family from the town of Modi'in, known to history as the Maccabees. Using guerrilla tactics against the superior Seleucid armies, the Maccabees achieved the impossible. They recaptured Jerusalem in 164 BC, cleansed the temple, and restored traditional Jewish worship, an event immortalized in the festival of Hanukkah. This victory was not only religious, but political. Following the Maccabean revolt, the Jews established the Hasmonean kingdom, securing fully independent rule over the land of Israel for the first time in over 4 centuries. Under the Hasmonean dynasty, the kingdom expanded its borders, conquering neighboring territories and consolidating Jewish sovereignty across the region. This period of independence lasted for well over a century, a rare era of self-rule in a history often defined by foreign domination. However, the Hasmonean court eventually became plagued by the same internal strife and dynastic rivalries that had undone the kingdom's predecessors. By the mid-1st century BC, a civil war between rival brothers for the throne weakened the state, leaving it vulnerable to the newest and most formidable superpower rising in the Mediterranean. In 63 BC, the Roman general Pompey the Great intervened in the conflict, marching his legions into Jerusalem. Though the Hasmonean dynasty continued for a few more decades, true independence was lost. The Romans installed client kings to manage the province on their behalf, the most famous of whom was Herod the Great. Herod was a master builder who renovated the Second Temple into a structure of breathtaking scale and beauty, but he was also a ruthless ruler who navigated the treacherous waters of Roman politics. Following his death, the Romans gradually tightened their grip, and by the early 1st century CE, the region was fully absorbed as the Roman province of Judea. Direct Roman rule brought heavy taxation and cultural insensitivity, fueling a simmering resentment among the population that was destined to explode. The stage was now set for a confrontation that would not only destroy the physical landscape of Judea, but would fundamentally reshape the destiny of the Jewish people for the next 2,000 years. The Roman occupation of Judea was not a peaceful coexistence. It was a powder keg of religious and political tension waiting to explode. The Jewish population, fierce in their monotheism, chafed under the idolatrous imagery and heavy taxation imposed by their Roman overlords. In the year 66 CE, these tensions finally boiled over into open rebellion in what became known as the First Jewish-Roman War, or the Great Revolt. The rebels initially scored surprising victories, driving the Roman forces out of Jerusalem and establishing a temporary independent government. However, the Roman Empire, then at the height of its military power, could not allow such defiance to stand. They dispatched their best legions under the command of Vespasian and his son Titus to crush the insurrection. In 70 CE, the Roman armies reached the gates of Jerusalem and laid siege to the city for 5 brutal months. The legions eventually breached the walls and unleashed a catastrophe that would scar the Jewish consciousness forever. They razed the city, massacred its inhabitants, and burned the Second Temple to the ground, leaving only the retaining wall of the Temple Mount standing. This surviving fragment, known today as the Western Wall, remains the holiest site where Jews are permitted to pray, a tangible link to their lost sovereignty. Yet the spirit of resistance was not entirely extinguished. 60 years later, in 132 CE, the Jews rose up once more in the Bar Kokhba revolt, a final desperate attempt to throw off the Roman yoke. The Emperor Hadrian responded with overwhelming force, brutally suppressing the revolt and deciding to erase the Jewish connection to the land entirely. He rebuilt Jerusalem as a pagan city named Aelia Capitolina, forbade Jews from entering, and renamed the province Syria Palestina. This marked the beginning of the Great Diaspora, as the center of Jewish life shifted from the land of Israel to foreign communities in Babylon, Europe, and North Africa. For the next 2,000 years, the land became a province in the empires of others, changing hands with the shifting tides of history. As the Roman Empire converted to Christianity in the 4th century, the land was transformed into a spiritual center for the new faith. Emperor Constantine and his mother Helena identified holy sites associated with the life of Jesus, constructing the Church of the Holy Sepulchre and drawing pilgrims from across the Christian world. However, Byzantine Christian rule would eventually crumble before the rising power of Islam in the 7th century. In 638 CE, Muslim armies under Caliph Umar captured Jerusalem, ushering in a new era for the region. The Umayyad Caliphate that followed constructed the iconic Dome of the Rock and the Al-Aqsa Mosque on the Temple Mount, cementing the city's status as a holy site in Islam alongside Mecca and Medina. For centuries, the land was ruled by various Islamic dynasties, from the Umayyads to the Fatimids, who generally tolerated the dwindling Jewish and Christian communities. But this relative stability was shattered in 1099 with the arrival of the Crusaders. Answering the call of the Pope to reclaim the Holy Land, European knights stormed Jerusalem, unleashing a horrific massacre upon its Muslim and Jewish inhabitants. The Crusader kingdom of Jerusalem lasted for nearly a century until it was dismantled by the Muslim warrior Saladin in 1187. The land then passed to the Mamluks of Egypt in the 13th century, who ruled for 300 years, a period when Jerusalem and the wider region gradually fell into decline. The final great imperial shift occurred in 1516, when the Ottoman Empire, under Sultan Selim I, conquered the region. Under his son, Suleiman the Magnificent, the walls of Jerusalem that stand today were rebuilt, and the region enjoyed a brief period of administrative renewal. For the next 4 centuries, the land of Israel was a district within the Ottoman province of Syria. While the empire was initially powerful and efficient, by the 18th and 19th centuries, it had entered a long period of stagnation and corruption. The land itself suffered from neglect. Ancient irrigation systems collapsed, swamps spread in the valleys, and the population dwindled. By the 1800s, the region was widely described by travelers as a desolate and sparsely populated backwater. The Jewish population in the land had been reduced to a small minority, living in the 4 holy cities of Jerusalem, Hebron, Tiberias, and Safed, largely dependent on charity from the diaspora. However, even during these centuries of desolation, the longing for return never faded from Jewish prayers. As the 19th century progressed, the sick man of Europe, as the Ottoman Empire was known, began to lose its grip on its vast territories. European powers began to encircle the decaying empire, jostling for influence in the Holy Land. Simultaneously, in the ghettos and shtetls of Eastern Europe, a new energy was stirring among the Jews. Faced with rising anti-Semitism and the awakening of national consciousness across Europe, they began to ask a radical question. Why wait for a messianic miracle to return them to their homeland? Why not take their destiny into their own hands and return to Zion themselves? This idea would spark one of the most remarkable and controversial movements of the modern age, setting the stage for the rebirth of a nation. By the late 19th century, the ancient dream of returning to Zion began to transform into a modern political reality. In 1882, triggered by waves of pogroms in the Russian Empire, the first major wave of Jewish immigrants, known as the First Aliyah, arrived in Ottoman Palestine. These early pioneers were not just religious pilgrims, but secular idealists who sought to work the land and build new agricultural settlements. However, the movement lacked a coherent political voice until the emergence of Theodor Herzl in the 1890s. Witnessing the virulent anti-Semitism of the Dreyfus Affair in France, Herzl concluded that Jewish integration in Europe was a lost cause, and that the only solution was political self-determination. He convened the First Zionist Congress in 1897, formally establishing the goal of creating a publicly recognized, legally secured home for the Jewish people in Palestine. As the 20th century dawned, the geopolitical tectonic plates began to shift with the outbreak of the First World War, which brought about the collapse of the Ottoman Empire. In 1917, British forces under General Edmund Allenby captured Jerusalem, ending 4 centuries of Ottoman rule and bringing the region under British military occupation. Crucially, in that same year, the British government issued the Balfour Declaration, pledging support for the establishment of a national home for the Jewish people in Palestine. However, the seeds of future conflict were sown immediately, as Britain had also made contradictory promises to Arab leaders, supporting their independence in exchange for military assistance against the Ottomans. To manage these competing national aspirations, the League of Nations granted Britain a mandate to govern the territory in 1922. Under the British mandate, the region underwent rapid transformation. Jerusalem's population alone surged from 52,000 to over 165,000 in just 25 years. Jewish immigration accelerated, fueled by rising persecution in Europe, while the local Arab population also grew significantly. Consequently, relations between the two communities deteriorated rapidly. The 1920s and the 1930s witnessed violent riots and uprisings as Arab leadership opposed the growing Jewish presence and British rule. The British found themselves caught in an impossible middle ground, issuing policy papers that restricted Jewish immigration just as the darkest shadow in human history was falling over Europe. The rise of Nazism and the subsequent outbreak of World War II in 1939 turned the need for a Jewish sanctuary from a political goal into an existential necessity. While the Holocaust decimated European Jewry, the Jewish community in Palestine, known as the Yishuvi, fought alongside the British against Germany, while simultaneously preparing for the inevitable struggle for independence. By 1947, Britain, exhausted by the war and unable to quell the sectarian violence, decided to hand the problem over to the newly formed United Nations. On November 29, 1947, the United Nations General Assembly voted in favor of Resolution 181, which proposed partitioning the land into two separate states, one Jewish and one Arab. Jerusalem, due to its religious significance, was designated to remain a neutral zone under international administration. The Jewish leadership accepted the plan, but the Arab leadership rejected it entirely, viewing it as a violation of the rights of the majority Arab population. The diplomatic failure led immediately to civil war. As the British mandate officially expired on May 14, 1948, David Ben-Gurion, the head of the Jewish Agency, stood in a museum in Tel Aviv and declared the establishment of the State of Israel. It was a moment of jubilation for the Jewish people, realizing a dream 2,000 years in the making. But there was no time for celebration. The very next day, the armies of 5 neighboring Arab states, Egypt, Jordan, Syria, Lebanon, and Iraq, invaded the fledgling state, aiming to strangle it at birth. The War of Independence had begun, and the survival of Israel hung by a thread. The war, which raged for over 9 months, was a desperate struggle for survival. Against overwhelming odds, the newly formed Israel Defense Forces managed to hold their ground and eventually push back the invading armies. By the time the armistice agreements were signed in 1949, Israel controlled not only the territory proposed by the United Nations, but also nearly 60% of the land proposed for the Arab state. However, the cost was high. Thousands of lives were lost, and the region was left with deep scars, including the displacement of hundreds of thousands of Palestinian Arabs and the subsequent arrival of hundreds of thousands of Jewish refugees expelled from Arab lands. The city of Jerusalem was left divided, split down the middle with barbed wire and concrete walls. The western half became Israel's capital, while the eastern half, including the Old City and the Temple Mount, fell under Jordanian occupation. For the next 19 years, the state focused on building its infrastructure, absorbing immigrants, and making the desert bloom through the National Water Carrier project. But the threat of annihilation remained ever present. In June 1967, tensions with Egypt, Syria, and Jordan reached a breaking point as Arab leaders openly called for Israel's destruction and amassed troops on the borders. Fearing an imminent attack, Israel launched a preemptive strike on the morning of June 5, 1967. In just 6 days, the map of the Middle East was redrawn. Israel defeated 3 Arab armies and captured the Sinai Peninsula and Gaza Strip from Egypt, the Golan Heights from Syria, and the West Bank and East Jerusalem from Jordan. For the first time in 2 millennia, Jerusalem was reunited under Jewish sovereignty, and Jews could once again pray at the Western Wall. While this victory provided Israel with strategic depth, it also brought over 1 million Palestinians under Israeli administration, creating a complex political and security challenge that remains unresolved to this day. 6 years later, the nation's confidence was shattered. On October 6, 1973, on Yom Kippur, the holiest day of the Jewish calendar, Egypt and Syria launched a surprise coordinated attack. Caught off guard, Israeli forces suffered heavy casualties in the initial days of the war. It took a massive mobilization of reserves and a US airlift of supplies to turn the tide, eventually pushing the Syrian forces back toward Damascus and surrounding the Egyptian Third Army. The trauma of the Yom Kippur War led to a shift in strategic thinking. Realizing that military victories alone could not guarantee long-term security, Israel began to pursue diplomatic solutions. In a historic breakthrough, Prime Minister Menachem Begin and Egyptian President Anwar Sadat signed the Camp David Accords in 1979. Israel returned the Sinai Peninsula to Egypt in exchange for the first ever peace treaty with an Arab nation, shattering the United Arab Front against the Jewish state. A similar peace treaty was signed with Jordan in 1994, further stabilizing the eastern border. While the conflict with the Palestinians continued through intifadas and failed peace negotiations, Israel simultaneously underwent a radical internal transformation. In the 1990s and the 2000s, the country pivoted from a socialist-leaning agricultural economy to a free market powerhouse. Leveraging the expertise of its military technology units and a massive influx of highly educated immigrants from the former Soviet Union, Israel emerged as a global hub for innovation. Today, the coastal plain is known as Silicon Wadi, home to thousands of high-tech startups and multinational research and development centers. Israel has become a world leader in cybersecurity, agricultural technology, and medical sciences, boasting one of the highest concentrations of engineers and scientists per capita in the world. However, modern Israel is a land of paradoxes. It is a secular, high-tech superpower that is deeply influenced by religious tradition. It is a vibrant democracy that continues to grapple with the complex status of the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. And it is a nation that, despite facing constant regional instability, consistently ranks among the happiest countries in the world. From a loose confederation of tribes in the Bronze Age to a kingdom destroyed by empires, from a people scattered across the globe to a nation reborn in the shadow of tragedy, the journey of Israel is a testament to resilience. Against all historical probability, the people of this land have not only returned, but have built a thriving, powerful state on the very hills where their ancestors walked 3,000 years ago. And that is the history of Israel.